Okay, for this video, we're going to be talking about Euroscepticism. So first off, what is it, right? We know what it means to be skeptical. So it means you have increasing doubts over the future of the EU. This can be brought on for a number of different reasons, which we're going to get into, right? One of them is EU enlargement, right? As it grows bigger, a lot of nations are worried that they lose their sovereignty along with it, and also it might increase the financial expectations on the larger and more powerful economic nations. We also have to think about who the Eurosceptics are. Not everyone is a Eurosceptic for the same reason. And we also have to think where the Eurosceptics are gaining power the most. And then also we should think of the more acute events that have triggered the rise of Euroscepticism. All right, so I wanted to include this video, which is actually getting into how Euroscepticism has contributed to Brexit, most specifically, which is going to be the topic of our next and final video. But in general, there are three major reasons why Euroscepticism has grown as of late. One of them is the Eurozone debt crisis, which we'll get into first. The next one is just general nativism, right? The fear of immigration, incoming migrants, even from other parts of the EU, and also refugees with the continuing crises like the Syrian civil war. And then lastly, democratic deficit, which in general means that EU citizens feel like they have less of a say in the future of their government. All right, so I just wanted to highlight this slide, not really talking about it too much, but what we see here is just generally the growth of Euroscepticism as a whole, and what we're seeing is that this poll was actually carried out right before the Brexit referendum in June of 2016. Almost half of all they polled 10 different states, but almost half of them argue that they had an unfavorable opinion of the EU. And I just want you guys to zoom in on Greece in particular, because they have an overwhelmingly unfavorable opinion on the EU. And we might think, well, why is that happening, particularly in Greece? Because in certain circumstances, they actually benefit economically from being in the EU, right? Because they can serve as a bailout, especially when the Greek economy started to experience a crisis. But nonetheless, they still don't like the EU because of the certain conditions that they've been forced to meet economically in order to receive help from the EU, and we'll get into that in a second. So let's talk about the Eurozone debt crisis, right? So let's zero in on Greece, but there are other nations too. Portugal's one of them, Italy, Spain, they too fell into this problem. When they joined the EU in 1999, of course, that gave them a little bit more economic security, right? One of the major reasons to join the European Economic Community was the access to the free trading bloc, right? And in general, that would help stimulate the economy in most member nations. The other thing that we see is that once the euro develops in the early 2000s, this is another huge incentive to join the EU. Nations that adopt the euro as currency are typically, especially the newer nations of the EU, are adopting a currency that was more stable than the one that they had on their own. So Greece, for example, was having much more difficulty borrowing. They couldn't get loans as easily because their former currency was very unstable. But when they joined the EU, they got easier credit because lenders knew that as an EU member, someone would pay back these loans. Even if Greece couldn't, someone in the EU would, which is precisely what happened. When the 2008 recession hit, the debtor nations, like Greece, couldn't pay off their debts anymore. So they turned to the European Central Bank and the IMF for a massive bailout, right? And the problem with this, and one of the reasons why this contributed to Euroscepticism, was that when there's an economic crisis, the EU bears the brunt of this crisis. They're going to have to bail out the nations that are suffering. So consider how this actually weakens the sense of community and belonging on both sides, right? The wealthier EU nations resent Greece and no longer want them really to feel like they belong in the community in the same way because they're causing this financial burden. And then Greece, too, feels ostracized within the EU. It also becomes increasingly angry with the way in which austerity measures were forced, dictated to them, and they also feel like they have little national sovereignty in this process. So with that said, just getting a little deeper into the Greek debt crisis. When they were unable to pay off their loans, they needed a bailout, right? So in exchange for these bailout funds, Greece had to engage in major austerity measures. You probably remember from when we talked about Mexico in the last unit that austerity means cutting back on spending, right? So, one of the things that is forced upon the Greeks is they have to hike taxes, and they also have to engage in pretty significant spending cuts. The reason why hiking taxes was increasingly unpopular was because Greece was actually really bad at collecting taxes prior. And so, by suddenly imposing this uh, increased burden on the population, this caused a lot of people to further resent the Greek government as well as the EU's government as a whole. Um, the Greeks are sort of forced as member nations to modify their economy on the EU's terms. So this makes them feel like they have less of a voice politically. Also, because of spending cuts, it leads to a spike in Greek unemployment rates. Not as many people can get jobs working for the state, and in general, there was just a decrease in spending overall, so there were not as many opportunities to work when people were spending less. More purchasing power tends to increase jobs, as we know. So consider also how this might impact migration, right? The unemployed might take advantage of EU free movement and seek employment elsewhere. Um, just generally, the Greek economic crisis has contributed to Euroscepticism because there's been a great general disapproval of the EU's handling of the economy. And this is for different reasons, right? Some member states resent bailing out Greece and see them as a financial burden on the EU as a whole, whereas the Greeks actually have become Eurosceptics because they feel like they have little control over their economic policy. This video worth watching if you want to get a little deeper into the Greek debt crisis, although this isn't essential for studying for the test. A lot of the other videos, pretty crucial that you watch those. But this one, if you don't have time, you could probably skip. Let's go to the next reason for Euroscepticism, and that is the increase of immigration, also just migration from one member EU nation to another. This is all leading to increased Euroscepticism. So just to give you a couple of facts and figures, in 2015 and 2016 alone, more than 2.5 million people have applied for asylum in the EU, and on top of that, there were 2.3 million illegal border crossings into the EU that were detected in those same 2 years. And so consider how this massive influx of peoples has contributed to the rise of Euroscepticism in the form of nativism, right? Nativism meaning the resentment of immigrants, right? So these massive numbers give us a sense of why Euroscepticism has grown very rapidly. And the general response to the increase of immigrants has been the rise of far anti-immigration parties rather in several EU states. So we see this in a party like UKIP in the UK, right? So in general, these more far right parties have advocated for policies like leaving the Eurozone, and also even leaving the EU altogether, which is what we see in Brexit. The last cause of Euroscepticism is this idea called a democratic deficit. So, in general, this is the feeling that EU citizens have less of a political say, right? They feel like increasingly, as the EU politically integrates, that they have less of an ability to shape the political direction of their nation because their nation is beholden to the laws of the EU as a whole. One of the reasons why this is that the EU's government is not particularly transparent. A lot of EU citizens argue that the EU is not very democratic. It seems inaccessible to ordinary citizens because it is a very complex and just bureaucratic operating system. You saw on your own, right, how sort of complicated the EU governance is. You probably know more than like 95% of the EU population on how that actually works just based on what you learned. It's a very complicated process that a lot of EU citizens don't fully understand, which is why they want more national sovereignty, right? And their argument is fairly valid about the lack of democracy within the European political institutions. Remember that the EU Parliament is the only EU institution that is directed or elected directly by its people, right? I guess the European Council would be the second most democratic because the people at least get to choose their heads of state, who then are the members of the European Council. But nonetheless, EU citizens have less say in who makes up the members of the other institutions like the Council of Ministers, right? Which shows us that with EU enlargement, individual nations have even less of a voice in institutions that are represented equally. So, for example, the Council of Ministers only has one minister per state. So, if the EU grows, then each state's voice weakens in that institution. And the general effect of the feeling of a democratic deficit is that people are not voting as much, right? So European Parliament elections have declined in voter turnout pretty much across the board, right? We can see this black line represents the total decline, which is considerable. And certain nations seem to have plummeted precipitously, like Greece, in recent years. All right, so this is going to be our last video. So we're going to stop and pick up with Brexit next. So stay tuned for that, and thanks.